I think a lot of people are going to be very surprised at some of these election results. I think that we've had a confluence of the polling industry collapsing and a sort of last gasp from our media, which is, again, mostly the mainstream media, mostly pushing, the same narrative, the same pieces of it. The polling industry collapsed after Romney, and I think that was the first national election that was far off from the polls. And I remember when it was happening, and you got to remember that this was right when landlines were starting to go away, and that was traditionally how pollsters took their polls, is they would essentially open the phone book and pick 1,000 random people. And the concept behind polling is still completely legitimate, right? It's not wrong. Nothing is completely accurate, but like the theory, the strategy behind the polling industry is correct. And it's very interesting because when you had a landline, it was a public thing. You got a phone book. You actually had to pay to have an unlisted number. So this was public stuff, and they could call you, and they'd be like, bling, bling, bling. Hello, Mr. Smith. We're the Trafalgar Group. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the upcoming election. And so, in the late 2000s, the noughts, landline usage was plummeting. As a matter of fact, Verizon was taking out, traditional copper lines, which was insane because I think it's insane because, copper lines are the one thing that used to work during a power outage because they worked on their own, super low voltage network. And, after the big blackout in 2003 in New York City, landlines were like gold. Man, I had one, and you could talk, you could call people and be like, I'm all right, blah, blah, blah. But Verizon wanted to push their Fios. They wanted to run everything digitally. And so that was a big contributor to people ditching their landlines. So when you get a triple play these days, if it's, cable, mobile, and landline, it's not really a landline, it's VoIP. So anyway, the collapse of landline usage, as well as the fact that polling companies were starting to blatantly and brazenly affect the answers. They were pushing answers. They were framing questions and things in a way that they could extract the answers that they wanted, or at least make the answers they didn't want less bad. So those things kind of happened at once, and there was a sense among those of us that were paying attention in 2008 that Romney actually was surging, and he might have a chance, because you got to remember that Obama was deeply unpopular. And no, it wasn't because he was a black dude. It was because his policies sucked. Just look at the midterms both times. He got, in his words, shellacked. And, they put up Romney, who is the biggest squish in modern history. And they tried to make this guy out to be, a racist dog killer with binders of women, or whatever that means. It was just comical. But, you got to remember that this was, the last of the mainstream narrative heyday. And although Romney didn't win, he outperformed. He did a lot better in a lot of places, and the polls indicated that he would. And for a lot of us, that was exactly what we were sort of feeling was happening, because again, I was paying attention back then, and I was looking at the polls, and I was even thinking about this, and I was watching exactly the things I was talking about happen, because I was working in the telecommunications business. I could see what was going on, and after Romney, it just got worse. The lack of landlines meant that the pollsters couldn't call people anymore. They can't legally, spam you on your cell phone. They used to be able to call you on your landline, right? I mean, if you're above a certain age, if you're Gen X and above, you remember your meal getting interrupted by a telemarketer or a phone call. That's when because they knew you were home, they would just spam you and call you, at 7:02 p.m. because their data showed that you were probably sitting down with your family having dinner, so they could do that. But it all changed, and you can't do that with a cell phone. And this took away a huge part of what made polling. And yeah, they still try and do it, and they do it with like Survey Monkey things and internet things, and they try and get you to, they try and do mobile stuff or tech stuff. It's the quality has just degraded greatly. And what was before 1,000 randos in the phone book, I mean, at least everybody had a phone, right? Like, you had rich people that had a phone, and you had poor people that had a phone, and it wasn't, I didn't know that many people that had unlisted numbers either. Even like the super wealthy family, like if you had an unlisted number, it was almost like you had to be like a celebrity or somebody that was prone to harassment or something, right? Like, and there was a, kind of an understood thing that unless you were doing prank calls, as a kid or something, that, you didn't abuse the landline, right? But that's how they got polls, and those went away. Polls got bad. But instead of, licking their wounds and re-strategizing, the polling companies, for the most part, well, I take that back. Some of them did. Some of them really sort of tried to, like, all right, this tool is our main tool is out of our tool chest. What do we do? How do we use these other lesser tools that we have to achieve some sort of, parity with the quality that we used to deliver? Some polling companies did that, but some companies, and again, these are hot properties with political campaigns, and it's completely understandable that they got politicized and they started selling their services as malleable to some degree, and they're not super open about this. It's not like, hey, come with Eric's polling company, we'll get you the results you want. Like, everybody pretends like they're above board, but the problem is it's very sloppy and extremely inaccurate, and you have a bunch of polling companies out there. Some are trying to do the right thing, and some aren't. And you can look at the last few cycles, and it's very easy to do. I don't know why more people don't do this, but you can look and you can see in the last few cycles which polling companies have been more accurate, right? And again, I know the left likes to hate on Rasmussen, but they were among the most accurate. And again, they weren't as accurate as they used to be before Romney, before the landline stuff, but they were amongst the pollsters the most accurate. And even they were off, right? And we look at even the 2020 election, right? Polls were way off. There were some of them that were so off. And the psychology of the polls is really fascinating to me, because like there's this, double secret, negative bank shot strategy that goes into, like, do you tell your boosters that they're up, or do you tell them that they're down, or do you, like, because right now we have the Dems kind of telling their people that they're up. And that's interesting to me, because if you follow this at all, the polling industry right now, in general, there's like a 5% you give the R 5% extra, and I think I'm probably being conservative with that, because especially since Romney, especially since the mechanics have changed, Republicans tend to not answer polls as much as Democrats do, and when they do, they lie. And then there's this squishy middle faction that when it's kind of weighty questions about like Black Lives Matter or immigration or something, you have a large swath of people that answer the way they think the polling people want them to answer, which is interesting. So the polls are off, and whenever I look at a poll, I give the Republican a couple points, because it's based on past experience. They just are under polled, they're underrepresented, and in almost every instance they have outperformed the official polls by at least that much. So that's what you do, and that's why I'm saying that I think that this election is going to be very surprising in some ways, and I think that based on that, that's why I've been saying I think Zeldin wins in New York. And I think that Oz wins. I think that, what's her face, and Kelly Lake is ahead. So we'll see. And Blake Masters, it looks like he's drawing even ahead. But I think we're gonna maybe see some results that are vastly different than the polls, and in some cases vastly different than what it feels like the momentum is. And I think that there is a chance that there might be some unrest, and that bothers me. I don't like unrest. If you have heard anything I've ever said, I'm hugely in favor of not that. It's hard changing the narrative. It's hard making your point. It's hard getting people out to vote. It's hard using the system, right? But we have to use the system. We have to use it, honorably and legitimately. And I think that when we do that, the people who are right will eventually win out. But I think that there's also a lot of factors at play, which are, I don't know. I think we're going to see. I think that there's going to be potentially some red wavy type stuff, and I think that there may be a couple blips of things that are weirdly in the other direction. And that bothers me. I need to be clear about that, because like in New York, even the polls, again, which I think are underrepresented, are showing that Zeldin is, within the margin of error. Some of them are showing him ahead. This is insanely disruptive to the assumption of the New York Democrats and Hochul, and they thought that she was a shoo-in. Zeldin is, slightly milquetoasty, which I think is a good thing. No offense. I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way. He's not a firebrand necessarily. And that makes him a little bit more accessible for especially the ex-Dems, the ex-default Dems, which are going to be the ones that push him over the edge, I think. But New York and some of these places have very, very deep blue roots and mechanics, and I think that there might be some places where some races are going to obviously go against the common wisdom, right? Which I think that we're going to see an overall trend, and I think that trend is going to be red wave, probably big. I think that if all goes well, smoothly, I would say Senate +3 GOP, and I would say House +20. And I think I'm being conservative in the House. I think it's going to be like, mid-20s, 30 maybe. It's going to be big. People don't like what's going on. People don't like everything costing twice what it did when Trump was in office with his mean tweets and everything. You know, people don't like this stuff. People are unhappy, and people don't like Biden. He's an invalid, and you know, these traditional trajectories still are true. You know, like in the midterms, traditionally, if the president is really unpopular, he gets shellacked in the midterms. Look at Clinton, look at Bush, look at Obama. You know, all of them, you know, had, you know, severe midterm losses because the president was very unpopular. He was underwater. And that's how it happens. So that's what should happen this time. And I would argue that Biden is more unpopular and things are worse than they were under Clinton, they were under Bush, and when they were under Obama. And Obama got like completely decimated in the midterms. It was historic. It was big numbers. And things are worse now. So who knows what's going to happen, but it's going to be interesting. I think that, you know, this idea that we're going to be counting votes for weeks afterwards is a very, very dangerous thing. I don't like it at all. And I think it needs to change. So, elections.